Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Julie Shields Rutina, and I am the Director of College Planning at MEFA. And this webinar today is part of the new MEFA Institute series, which is a series of topics and lessons on all kinds of things about planning, saving, paying for college. And we hope to be able to deliver this in this way to support you in all of the work you do every day with students. So I'll ask you also to keep in touch with us and let us know. You'll get a survey at the end of this just asking what you learned and was it useful, but please keep in touch with us about any topics you want to hear about. And we would really like to support you through the whole year on, we know this year especially, you have your work cut out for you. But today, we're so lucky to have a special guest with us, Andrea Keenan, a school counselor at Excel Academy. And she's going to speak with us about supporting undocumented students, a very important topic, a topic we get lots of questions on. And Andrea has a lot of expertise in this area, and I know that we'll learn a lot. I have muted all of you at the moment because it's just easier to not have background noise, but please ask questions. So right over to the right, you have a little question box, and ask your questions. I'll be monitoring that as we go along. Let me see if there's any other housekeeping, just that we will, I attach the slides, the handouts, so if you want to download those, have them, and I'll also send those to you tomorrow along with a copy of this video recording. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Andrea, and thank you so much for doing this for us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so pleased to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I will see. I'll give you the thumbs up. If anyone wants to just put a yes, we can hear you well. Yep, someone raised their hand.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
Good. Let me know if you have any problems, everyone. Okay.
One never knows with this medium.
I know.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for having me, for inviting me. I have about 55 minutes with you all. So I'm going to talk pretty quickly. I'm going to cover a lot today. So I'm glad that you all will be getting a copy of the slides. If for some reason I kind of breeze through a topic and you want to dive deeper, you'll have the slides as reference. And then, of course, you know, I'm always a resource. You can always get in touch with MEFA, get in touch with me to ask any follow-up questions. If after, you know, a few days you're still mulling things over, thinking, oh, I should have asked that, or actually I have a follow-up question. So, like you can see, my name is Andrea Keenan, formerly Navarro. I have a little agenda for us today. I'm going to introduce myself, introduce sort of what I'm hoping to talk to you today. I'm going to be sharing my slides, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some open Q&A. But please, you know, chime in throughout and type in your questions, and hopefully we'll get to all of them. So I just want to name, you know, we're going to cover a lot. Hopefully this will pique your interest, will give all of us a really good foundation as we work with our students. But by no means can I cover everything about working with undocumented students in a school setting in an hour. So I just want to name that for everyone. You know, I don't know yet who's in the webinar with us today, how many attendees. Oh, we have 17 of you, yay. But, you know, a lot of you might have different comfort levels with this topic. Some of you might not be as new in this topic. So I'm hoping to cover a lot, but just want to name that not going to get through everything, and it's going to hopefully just elicit a lot of good discussion at the end. This is me, a little bit about me. I am the Director of College and Career Counseling at Excel in East Boston. I've been in counseling and advising for about 9 years. Most of those 9 years have been spent advising families in a secondary and post-secondary setting, and I've been working with undocumented families for almost that long. And so everything that I'm going to be sharing with you today is from my own lived experience, from my own research, from talking to a lot of counselors. After working with hundreds of undocumented families at this point. I've sort of got my best practices that I want to share with you. I've done also a lot of research, talked to a lot of immigration lawyers in terms of what you'll hear today about statuses. But my disclaimer is I'm by no means an immigration law attorney. So everything is factual in this presentation, but I'm speaking from the lens of school counselor, ally, and advocate. I am not undocumented, but have a lot of experience on the personal and professional side with this arena. It's really just a huge passion of mine, and really dedicating my life to making sure that these student voices don't go unheard. I was born in Mexico and immigrated to the United States. So from a personal perspective, I have lived through that immigration journey, and so can speak a little bit about that as well. So let's get started. My frame for this presentation is giving you the tools to be an effective ally in a school setting. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about different statuses, what they mean for students, giving you that broader context, and then we'll dive into actual strategies for the post-secondary planning process. What role do we play in our schools? I'm guessing there are a lot of counselors and educators in the audience right now, and the way I've thought about this for my own practice, and I created this infographic here, is I sort of serve three primary sort of roles in the lives of my students, especially my undocumented students and students with complex immigration statuses. I'm here to advocate for them, but mostly I'm here to inform them and empower them to do their own advocating. That's really important. Sometimes as educators, we just are so natural at trying to help others, and it just comes easily to us. But with this particular population, the help needs to be there, obviously, but taking it a step further and really trying to stay informed, stay abreast of everything that's happening. Things are changing very quickly in this landscape, and then imparting that sort of information to your students so that they feel empowered to then advocate for themselves, be it with admissions offices, in their own lives, maybe in the political arena. Once they get to college on campus, we really need to make sure that they feel empowered to be able to use their voices. This is a population that often feels cast aside or in the shadows because of the fragility of their immigration statuses in this country. And so in the safe space that is a school, we really want to make sure that we're lifting up their voices and empowering them to do the same. So that's sort of my general attitude going into this work. Now I want to give you a little bit of the larger context. In front of you, you see a lot of words: U.S. national, naturalized citizen, statuses that grant I-94s, asylum granted, asylum pending, refugee, TPS, temporary protective status, permanent resident, conditional permanent resident, T visa, U visa, JNF visas, other types of DACA, family-sponsored visas, VAWA, Self-Petitioner, Violence Against Women Act, Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, and Undocumented. Why do I share these words with you today? These are all different types of terms and statuses in the immigration landscape. It's not as easy as saying, I'm a citizen, I'm undocumented. There's so much gray area. It is so nuanced. There are so many statuses out there. The immigration landscape right now is really complex in the United States. It's been very complex. And so when you're working with students with complex immigration status or undocumented, I really just want to name that, they might not be undocumented. They might have another type of status. They might be in between statuses. Their family might be petitioning for a different status. And so if a student self-discloses to you, and we'll get to that in a little bit, it's really important to thank them for self-disclosing, for acknowledging that what they did was very brave. You were clearly a trusted adult for them. If they're seeking you out as a counselor or as an educator, it's because they trust you and they need help. What you can do then in return is what I just said: thank them, affirm their bravery, but also just ask a few more questions. Try to get to know them. Try to get to know, why they're asking for help. It's not as easy as saying I'm undocumented, and so it's a one size fits all. Some of these statuses are a pathway to citizenship, such as asylum granted. When a person's granted asylum, they're granted sort of that next level, that permanent resident card, and that could then lead to citizenship. A permanent resident, you've heard of that. It's a green card that also leads to citizenship. But then there are other statuses that don't lead to citizenship. Temporary protective status, TPS, that's been in the news a lot. That right now hangs in the balance. T visa, U visa, J and F visas, we've heard of all these visas. DACA, that's been in the news a lot. That is also threatened right now. Violence Against Women Act protects not only women, but men as well, and that is a pathway to citizenship. I tell you all this so that you at least feel like you've heard these words, so that if a student says something like this to you, it doesn't take you by surprise. You at least feel like you have some base level knowledge of like, oh, okay, these statuses exist. Let me do a little bit further reading to educate myself on maybe the intricacies or how I can play a role in connecting the student with resources.
And Andrea, we do have one quick question about that. Someone asked, do you find that many times students don't know what status they're in? Does that happen?
That is such a great question. It's like you read my mind. Another talking point that I had on this next slide is precisely that. I think a lot of times students have no idea what their status is or know that it's a complicated status. Culturally, sometimes parents, I've lived this with many of my families and friends, culturally, a lot of parents want to keep this from students to protect them emotionally. And so they might say, don't talk about this in school, or I'm not going to tell you too much, but just know that you can't talk about this. And so oftentimes as a high school counselor, these conversations are not being had openly. The student is scared to say, I need help. And so these conversations sometimes don't even come to light until senior year, when the student is filling out a FAFSA, for example, wanting to fill out a FAFSA, come to find out they probably can't qualify for federal aid. And so I think, yes, I think that is a very real thing. And so that's why I think if you are in the position to be a trusted adult for a student, that's when you can really sort of leverage that student-family relationship and dig a little deeper. We're going to get to what you should and shouldn't ask later on. But if a student has already self-disclosed to you, there's nothing stopping you from saying, hey, would it be okay if maybe I called home? Would your mom want to tell me a little bit more? I just really want to help you, and I want to make sure that you get the help that you need. I feel like I need a little bit more information before I can actually tell you what resources are available for you.
Great.
Hope that answered your question. So what I was going to say too with this slide is, from all of these statuses, the highlighted ones here are statuses that are eligible for federal financial aid, which is something important to note. Studentaid.gov has a pretty good resource on all the statuses that are eligible for Title IV funds. And so even this feels important to say. If a student has asylum that's been granted and they have an I-94, they can receive federal funds. Refugee status, the same, of course, permanent resident. And then the T visa is the only visa out there that is eligible for federal aid. Something to keep in mind. So to kind of dovetail on what I just said, who is considered documented? Who is eligible for federal aid? The federal government defines it as these three categories: U.S. citizens and nationals, U.S. permanent residents. Those two categories I think are the easiest, most commonly heard of. But then we have this third sort of vague category called eligible non-citizens. In this category, federal financial aid handbooks define it as this. So these are documented eligible non-citizens that are eligible for federal financial aid. Now, I'm not going to go through each one, but my point is here that if you're working with a junior or senior in high school and they say, Miss, I'm not a citizen. I can't apply for federal aid. Don't take them at their word. You know, to speak to that earlier question, they might not know. And so we want to make sure we do our due diligence to make sure that we educate the student and the family as to whether they are actually eligible or not eligible for federal aid. I've had a lot of students come to me who have received asylum thinking they can't apply for federal aid. And they can, because they've been granted asylum and it's part of what the government says, or is part of the category that the government says is eligible. So I would say keep this handy. I can also share a lot of different resources and links with MEFA that they can send out or post on their website that I sort of bookmark in my browser whenever I need to either share it with a student, share it with family, or remind myself. I would highly recommend that you do the same. Just bookmark a page or two to remind you in case this comes up with a student. These are some other statuses that come up a lot in schools, especially, you know, if you are in a more densely populated city. There are a lot of, you know, beautiful immigrant communities all around the state. And so you may, if you work in that kind of district, see some of these other statuses. I want to name these statuses are not eligible for federal aid, but they do receive an employment authorization card. So I guess here the difference is that a green card, a permanent resident card, is what a permanent resident would get, or someone granted asylum, someone in these categories. These statuses receive an employment authorization card, which looks very similar to a green card, a permanent resident card, but it does not grant you those additional federal aid benefits. And so a status like temporary protective status or DACA, right? They can't receive federal aid, but they do have this employment authorization card, which is great because it allows them to legally reside and work in the United States. So sometimes, I'll come back to that previous slide. Sometimes, you know, I have some juniors or seniors coming to my office, ready to fill out the FAFSA, and they show me an employment authorization card. And so that to me signals you have a documented status, you can work, file taxes, but for federal aid, it's a no-go. And so those conversations are really, really tough with students and families if they don't have that permanent resident card. It's still great because they have a documented status. That's still something worth celebrating and naming for them, but that's really, really tough. Which is why we're going to touch upon later on in this presentation how to create an undocu-friendly culture in your counseling office and in your school so that students know that your school is a safe space where they can reach out for help sooner than junior or senior year. We want to make sure that students are getting adequate counseling and college and career counseling earlier on so that it doesn't come to 12th grade, they're filling out the FAFSA, now they're finding out, and you are finding out they can't count on those federal funds. And so here visually you can see the difference between a permanent resident card and employment authorization card. They look very, very similar. Now technically for a FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, as long as the student has a social security number, they can fill out a FAFSA. Now the difference is that both of these card holders would have a social security number, right? But only the permanent resident card holder can get the funds. So I've actually had students that I've counseled in the past. In my previous role, I worked in a community-based organization. So I wouldn't know the students. They would come in and say, hi, why am I getting a FAFSA error code? I have a social, I filled out my FAFSA, can you help me? Would come to find out they filled out the FAFSA because they have a social, but they have an employment authorization card. So the system on the back end caught that and flagged it as it couldn't process the FAFSA. So it's not impossible for an employment authorization card holder to fill out the FAFSA, right? It just won't go anywhere because the Social Security Administration can't validate that Social Security number as a Social Security number entitled to federal funds. So again, these are the tough conversations that sometimes we're having. Right now, you've probably heard of temporary protective status. That's been in the news a lot. It is currently threatened by the federal administration. TPS holders will have employment authorization cards. There are certain countries eligible for TPS right now, but those, like I said, those statuses could be threatened. If those statuses are canceled, for example, if the TPS is revoked for Haiti, for example, that would mean that all of the Haitian TPS holders would have to either leave the country, unfortunately, or find alternate statuses in order to reside in the US. This is tragic. I just want to name, this is really hard for a lot of our families and a lot of our students. I also want to say, though, if that were to happen, so keep an eye out on the news, if that were to be revoked for any of the countries currently on TPS, the families, the holders would have a certain amount of months, sort of like a grace period, before they would have to technically leave the country. That gives us and buys us practitioners who work with these families some time to get them connected to legal resources before they would have to leave. So no one is going to get deported the day after, for example, a TPS is revoked. But it does pose some really real risks for families who hold this status. I'm going to pause here and ask if there are any questions coming through in the chat that I might be able to answer.
I think you're good to keep going right now, and
Okay.
I'll stop you. Yeah, thank you.
Great. I kept seeing something flicker, so I was wondering. So yeah, I think the tone of this presentation sometimes is a little bit or very bleak. Right now we're living in really tough times. The tone of this presentation would have been different, say 6-7 years ago. Right now it's much more about arming practitioners such as yourselves with a toolkit and base knowledge so that students can thrive within the very limited parameters that we have right now. So kind of shifting gears to sort of trying to define now more the undocumented student. I think it's very important to name that the United States has a very complicated immigration system. It's very different than in other countries. And in the United States, it takes on average 10 to 16 years for a skilled worker to get on the pathway to citizenship. So by skilled worker, we mean someone who is coming from a different country with an advanced degree or very technical expertise. Engineers, for example, data scientists, highly coveted professions. Even for them, it would take a person like that on average 10 to 16 years to get on a pathway to citizenship. They would have to be sponsored, get an employer-sponsored visa, transition into a green card, then wait 5 years, then apply for citizenship. Can you imagine then what the other thousands and thousands of people entering the United States are up against? It's much, much longer. That's why, without getting political here, that's why comprehensive immigration reform matters for students, especially high school students. And that's why I think being very transparent with students, creating an undocu-friendly culture in counseling offices and school matters, because they're the ones that will be living with this reality, and they're the ones that have a lot of power to change it, both at the federal and state level. And us, as privileged practitioners, we also have a lot of agency over our cities and state level immigration policies. So I'm gonna, I always share this infographic. I'll make sure that, hopefully you'll be able to see this when you get the slides. This just kind of visually goes through what the immigration system is like here in the US, sort of the ups and downs and the pitfalls of the system. So already the playing board is not, is kind of rigged against people wanting to immigrate to the United States. And so if our families are immigrating to the United States and we have undocumented students, there are two definitions of an undocumented person. and you can read them right here. 1, you entered the US without inspection, meaning you came into the US, you didn't have a document to say that you can reside here legally. You came in with nothing or with fraudulent documents. Or 2, you entered legally as a non-immigrant, for example, on a visa, but eventually you let that visa expire. In both of these cases, you then are left with no documentation. And so you would become undocumented. A lot of our families and students come over, and you might not know in which category they are in, and you don't really need to know really, but where it does kind of matter is when we're talking about Dreamers and the DREAM Act. You've heard of those terms, I'm sure. And for young people who are Dreamers, that is really a child or a person that immigrated when they're young and not of their own free will. In most cases, they were too young to know. They've grown up here in the United States. This is the only country they know. They're by all intents and purposes American as well, but they don't have that legal documentation. And so this definition matters a lot of times for those students, for example, applying for DACA, which is not the DREAM Act, by the way, but we'll get to that, or that eventually want to apply for a status. But in our day-to-day lives, you don't really need to know how a student got undocumented. But I wanted to make sure that you knew that this is how a person can become undocumented in this country. This information comes from the Pew Center. It's a few years old, but I think it kind of shows us sort of how important school counselors and educators are for our undocumented students and our undocumented young people. If we have around, 11.2 million undocumented immigrants living in the US, 1.1 million of those, again, these numbers are a few years old. These could be outdated, and they probably are very outdated at this point, but that we know of, 1.1 million documented children under the age of 18 living in the US. 65,000 of those are graduating high school every year, and only 7,000 to 13,000 are actually enrolling in college. So if the numbers don't speak for themselves, I don't know what will. You matter. You are in a school helping young people choose their post-secondary path. You saying to a student you can go to college can be the difference maker for so many of them. So we need to change that last number. And some of you might have already been familiar with this topic, so this could seem obvious to you, but I think when we're working with undocumented high school students in particular, it's worth naming that not all of them fall under the profile of high achieving. We hear and we love to hear about, the undocumented, the wonderfully brave undocumented valedictorian who gave her graduation speech. And we love to hear these success stories of this, of talented young people going to Harvard, making their dreams come true while being undocumented. That is amazing. We want to continue to champion those students, of course. But as a counselor, you will see a lot of undocumented students who don't fit that profile, whose GPA is much, much lower, who maybe have heard very early on that they can't go to college, so they stop trying. Of course, they have the potential, just on paper, right? We would not, from like a college counseling perspective, say, oh, that is a, high achieving student and they can go to Harvard. They really, the post-secondary plans, we have to get creative as counselors counseling undocumented students. And we'll get to this a little bit later. Something also that is tough and that we should keep in mind is that sometimes if a student is fully undocumented, so doesn't have any work authorization, they are right off the bat ineligible for very specific degrees or professions that require state certification. These are the toughest cases to, as a human, deal with, as a human who has relationships with students, because you never want to tell a student, you can't do this. but it's about getting creative. So for example, nursing. Nursing is a very popular field. And if an undocumented student tells me, Ms. Keenan, I want to be a nurse, the wheels will be turning in my mind, right? How can this student, A, get connected to legal resources so that maybe in a few years, that attorney could help them get some sort of status? And then in that parallel vein, how can the student enter post-secondary education with the ultimate goal of becoming a nurse, even if she can't become, or he can't become a nurse right away? So I never tell a student they can't do something, but if they are going for these very specific degrees, professional degrees that require certification and a work permit right away, I try to frame it for them as, you can do it. It might not happen really, really soon, but let's try to get you on a path where you're at least earning some college credits that put you toward that, ultimate post-secondary goal. And then if you're in Massachusetts, if you're listening, for us here in the state, it's getting increasingly hard for students to travel. So you may have heard of the Real ID. This is a significant shift from our earlier sort of licenses and ID processes that we had in this state. So right now, if you go to a DMV or RMV, you'll be asked for many more forms of identification or proof of citizenship, proof of birth, proof of name, all these proofs that are really hard to come by if you're undocumented. So more and more our sophomores in high school or juniors in high school are finding it really, really tough to do those normal teenagery things, right? Get your permit, get a job. And so I think very early on in high school, if you are astute, and all of you are, you could probably pick up on some signs of students who maybe at that point, at that juncture in their lives, start to recoil. Maybe they just turn 16 and then they suddenly get sad because they can't do the things that all their other friends are doing. And so if you're in the position to counsel students that are in that age, it's never too soon to start talking to them about resources and also, post-secondary paths. I think the hardest thing is obviously knowing which students need help, but if you create an undocu-friendly culture, which we'll talk about in your offices, I promise you the students will come to you. They'll see you as someone they can talk to, and if you get them early enough, you can really alter the course of their lives. You can give them hope, you can give them tools, you can give them resources, so that they get on the path toward, their own version of success. So I'm going to move us along.
And Andrea, I'll ask one question that I think kind of falls into what you were just talking about. Someone asked if you've found that apprenticeships and tradespeople have been willing to hire students with a work authorization.
Yeah, so as long as that work authorization is valid and it hasn't expired, they're good to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Absolutely. And so I'll, when we get to those slides in a little bit, I'll talk about, some like creative ways to get students to be able to maybe be self-employed, learn a trade, work for themselves when they don't have those work authorizations. So I guess sort of to kind of continue on that sort of vein of what I was saying, students will be affected by their status or lack thereof. I still didn't steal, but I borrowed this slide from United We Dream's former DEEP curriculum. I think it's so beautiful in that it's straight to the point. These students are defending and surviving every single day instead of living and thriving. And I think we play such a critical role in a school where we can try to intervene sooner and try to get them to realize that there's a lot of options for them. We just have to dig a little deeper and get creative. Mental health, if I have any social workers or counselors, mental health counselors in the audience, I think this is really where your talents can be put to wonderful use, advocating for some mental health supports in your school, or at least make them available for students to take advantage of, for specifically targeting undocumented students. I find that, I'll skip to this slide, I find that the atmosphere of a school, of an office, of a counseling suite can be a miracle worker. Something as simple as putting up a poster, right? Or wearing a button every day that says, I stand with dreamers. I stand with undocumented people. I will fight for you. It goes a long way. Students are always listening. They're always looking around. And if they see that you're someone they can go to, they will go to you. So there are a lot of great ideas online for ways to sort of spice up the office and really just make it so welcoming for this population. I will skip over this slide, but you will have access to this this writing. It really just talks about your continued education in little low lift ways. You know, pinning a news outlet that reports on immigration happenings, or attending trainings such as this one. You're already being an ally and an advocate, and students can totally sense that. And so to kind of close out this section of what we kind of want to do and not do in a school setting, you know, I've talked about the atmosphere. I've talked about how far that can really go to draw students close to you to seek help. But it's really important to also name that there are certain things that we cannot do in a school setting, really just anywhere, anytime. And that is, we can never ask a student or a family their immigration status. You know this if you work in a school. You just can't do it. But you know, they can self-disclose to you, and if that happens, that really is such a gift. Like I said earlier, thank them, affirm them, say that you are there for them, and always, you know, keep that circle of trust and always follow up with them. You know, if you need to seek additional resources or help, then do so. And this is more of just like, Ms. Keenan, I have a question about my status. I'm nervous that I can't go to college. So it's these type of self-disclosures. Obviously, if there's something bigger, more urgent going on at home, so you were mandated reporters, so then obviously the conversation shifts. But if it's something related to college and their status, you know, you can definitely keep that between you, yourself, and the family, and just be their trusted adult and sort of their go-between, you know, them and then the resource that you're going to kind of point them to. And we're going to talk about resources in a little bit. I always also say when I'm training fellow teachers and counselors is to always try to avoid writing sensitive information, especially before a family is giving me permission to discuss their status with other people, even if it's well-meaning. Even if you're emailing me, for example, to say, hey, I need help with this student's you know, financial aid, they're undocumented. That is something that we would never write in an email. We need to protect their privacy at all costs. So what I always say is, you know, maybe a quick email saying, I have a question, it's related to immigration. That is perfectly safe. And then over the phone or face-to-face, you can then talk more openly about the specific scenario with a colleague. So face-to-face chats are always the way to go. And as you're building your undocu-friendly office and you're bringing in more students seeking help, you will start to know who is documented, who might be undocumented. As you're filling out FAFSA, things will come up if you're a college counselor. But please don't keep a written list anywhere of who is undocumented, both to protect you and mostly to protect the students. Mental lists are fine. So I have a mental list right now in my mind, but we don't want to put those things in writing. And then I'm going to leave you with a challenge here on the slide to think about your own organization's stance on undocumented student allyship. You know, do you have something on your website that says we are open, we stand with undocumented individuals, we stand with dreamers? Do you have a little statement in your counseling materials that encourage people to reach out with questions. These are all little low-lift things. So really try to be introspective in this moment and say, hey, are there one or two things we could do in our office, in our program, that could go a long way to supporting our undocumented population? I always show this slide, and it's very, very complicated. It's kind of silly, but I hope that it gives you a sort of a visual of sort of the role that we can play in the school setting. Again, we are not immigration lawyers. They can deal with the legal part of it. What we need to do is make sure that we are the bridge to resources for our students. The final outcome, so let me orient you to the bottom of this slide. The final outcome for many families is to get citizenship, or to get permanent residency, or to resist deportation, or to petition. So as a family unit, if a family is mixed status or is undocumented, their sole goal really in a lot of facets of their life is going to be to get a status in this country. And so what we can do as educators who care about the students we're with is to make sure that we're pointing them toward resources. The best way, the easiest way to do this is to give them access to organizations that provide low cost or free legal screenings. These legal screenings are usually very short, sometimes with volunteer attorneys who will sit down and listen to a family story and then be able to point them in the right direction. For a lot of families, this is an entry point to a greater legal system that could help them out. These legal screenings, I would always point you toward reputable sources. If you're in Massachusetts, the MIRA Coalition, MIRA, has a wonderful sort of directory of trusted legal aid in Massachusetts. That's always sort of my first point of reference. The city of Boston has immigration clinics twice a month. And so there are free resources out there. A lot of families don't know about these resources, so they often end up going to local immigration resources in their area that end up overcharging. They might not even be completely, vetted or certified. And so always try to just give them these concrete next steps. But that's it. After that, they're in the legal process. We can't really do much there. If a family is already working with someone, though, with a lawyer, what we can do as school administrators or staff or counselors or teachers is provide them with, day-to-day support. Do they need time off to attend a hearing, for example? Does a student need extra time on an assignment? Can you advocate for a student to get extra time because they've been busy with certain immigration things? Or do they need letters of support? Sometimes trusted adults in a school building are asked by families to write letters of support to support their immigration case. That is a completely normal thing to do and something that can really add value to a family's immigration proceedings. So let's get to the education stuff. This is just more tactical information for those students who are trying to access higher education. Institutional aid at different colleges may be available. Policies vary school to school, which makes a presentation like this very hard because I'd love to be able to give you a list and say, these 10 colleges in the Boston area, they offer this type of aid, and these colleges, this is their stance on undocumented students. And unfortunately, it's not that clear cut. So what I would say is for an undocumented student, always think through your Rolodex of colleges to think about those that give merit aid to students based on obviously their GPA. That's a really easy way to know if that school will be accessible to the student. Also need-based aid, but keep in mind an undocumented student doesn't receive federal or state aid. So the financial aid, need-based financial aid, will end up being institutional as well. So whether it's merit-based or or need-based, it really will kind of come back to will this school be able to offer institutional aid? My next sort of tip as a counselor is to be honest about immigration status in as much as possible with the admissions offices. The admissions offices want to know or need to know if the student is undocumented, because if they don't disclose, the admissions offices will assume they're international students and will start the visa process for them. So it's really important to disclose that status. It's safe to do so. FERPA kind of intervenes and sort of protects the student's information in that way, which is great. The CSS Profile, for those of you that are familiar with financial aid applications, in addition to the FAFSA, the CSS Profile exists as a way to capture a lot of information, and that is a great way to self-disclose to a school in the special circumstances section of the CSS Profile. In terms of who can help in a college, I think more and more with every passing year, the topic of how to help undocumented students is becoming more widely accepted, more widely talked about, which is awesome. 10 years ago, you called an admissions office, to be honest, and people didn't know what to do with a question around undocumented students. Now, the landscape is changing. People are becoming more educated on how to help undocumented students, or to at least even know what the school's policy is on undocumented students. If you're coaching your student, though, to be sort of proactive, and maybe you want to have the student call to ask if a certain type of institutional scholarship, for example, is available to DACA holders, for example. If you're having your student call, I would always sort of advise you to look through the list of contacts at the school and sort of encourage your student to reach out to the office, someone in the admissions office who works with multicultural students or international students. Those admissions officers will be more familiar with the lingo and the verbiage around how to help undocumented students. And then something that's very interesting that a lot of you might know, but the student for admissions purposes might be considered domestic, but for the financial aid purposes might be considered international if they're undocumented, right? Because domestic, from the admissions perspective, they've been to high school, they know they have that US high school transcript, they've been living in the US. So they're very much treated domestically, like a domestic student for the admissions process, but where it gets tricky is the financial aid office won't necessarily get a FAFSA, and so they might be treated like international students. It's always worth calling and fact finding.
And can I ask you a question about that, Andrea? Someone asked, did you encourage students to complete the FAFSA if they're absolutely undocumented in order to connect with certain other resources, or will that put them in danger? Or is there any reason to encourage them to do a FAFSA?
Sure. So if the student is completely undocumented, they can't physically do a FAFSA because they don't have a social security number. So if the student has no social security number, there's no way the FAFSA can be completed. But if the student has one of those other statuses we talked about, DACA, TPS, where they have a social but they don't have that permanent residency card, there are some schools that will ask them for student aid reports, so that sort of finalized printed version of their FAFSA, and that will help the school determine eligibility for institutional aid. So it's a nice way for the student for the school to collect information on the student and family's finances, even though it won't be used for federal aid. So I have heard of that happening. So some campuses do that. Some scholarships as well. If a private scholarship is open to non-citizens, they will often have to ask the students to fill out the FAFSA and print out a copy of, or send a copy of their student aid report. So to be clear, again, we're coming back to that sort of gray area of statuses. There is that gray middle area where you're not a citizen, you're not permanent resident, you don't qualify for financial aid, federal financial aid, and you're not quite undocumented. So that gray area is where it gets really tricky. So I would always encourage you to fact find with the school to ask what their individual policy is and how they treat a student that doesn't qualify for federal aid.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then I think it bears repeating, there's no federal law that prohibits the admission of undocumented students in US colleges. There are at the state level, some colleges, some state college systems that do ban enrollment of undocumented students, but there's no federal law that does that. And so this map is interesting if you're tuning in from outside of Massachusetts. It kind of shows you the current state laws and policies for undocumented immigrants. I should say, this is probably not labeled entirely correctly, for undocumented immigrants. So you can see that there are some states that ban enrollment to undocumented students, right? So that is sort of where it varies from the state level policy, right, for public campuses, but federally, especially for private institutions, undocumented students can absolutely apply and should apply. There should be no barrier there. And so this is kind of getting at the earlier question, FAFSA CSS profile. So as long as the student has a social security number, they can apply. But again, their status will determine whether they actually can receive the federal funds or whether they're just applying for the FAFSA for institutional aid. If a parent is undocumented, but the student has a social, obviously the student can still fill out a FAFSA, but in the parent social security questions, you would just type in all zeros for the parents and then have the parent sign using a signature page. So they wouldn't be able to use an FSA ID. And then the CSS profile for private institutions is open to all students. And like I said earlier, could be a great way for a student to self-disclose to the institution only. A quick note on Massachusetts and DACA. If a student that you're working with has DACA status or temporary protective status, they are eligible for in-state tuition rates at any public institution in Massachusetts, which is great. This is obviously an area for growth. We don't have sort of a state level DREAM Act in place, so undocumented students still have to pay full out-of-state prices at public institutions, which is really, really hard. But if they have DACA and TPS, they get in-state tuition. So that's great, and you should keep that in mind when you're advising your students. So I mentioned, this memo just says DACA, but TPS also qualifies for in-state tuition in Massachusetts. Again, if in doubt, always ask an admissions office if the student status qualifies them for in-state tuition if they have status other than DACA or TPS, like an asylum pending, for example. Some other tips while students are in high school. This is a slide that a colleague of mine and I made together when we did a similar presentation quite a few years ago. These are tips that I think we in our day-to-day practice might have the intentions of saying, oh yeah, I know that dual enrollment is great, or CLEP is great, or AP exams are great, but to actually in practice push your students to actually take advantage of these resources. So for an undocumented student especially, the CLEP exam is a very specialized subject-based exam where if they take that exam, they are then able to earn college credit. So I've had some undocumented students, for example, who are very, very good at math or very, very good at Spanish, their native language. And so they've taken CLEP exams in those subjects. They're very short exams, multiple choice, and then they're able, if they pass, to get college credit, say at a community college or a junior college, to maybe waive their, for example, their math prerequisite requirements, so they don't have to pay extra money for those prerequisite courses, or to waive their foreign language elective requirement. And so that saves them money in the long term. It might not sound like much to waive a class or two, But in the grand scheme of things, for an undocumented student especially, every penny counts. Similarly, for your higher achieving students, higher scores in EP exams can also really help them skip or waive some classes when they get to college. Dual enrollment is something that I think is very interesting, and I always bring up when I'm talking to counselors, because we actually, if you're a school administrator or have access to school administrators, we actually have a lot of power for advocacy in this realm. Set up a dual enrollment program between your high school and a private college. That is a great way to have students earning college credits without having to pay money. I say private institution as ideal because that way undocumented students can also take advantage of those opportunities. Dual enrollment is amazing regardless, but it is the case that if a high school has a dual enrollment agreement with a public institution, that sometimes because those are state-funded public dollars, undocumented students often have a hard time joining because of their lack of status. So do a little research, see if that's possible, try to maybe see if, that's something that you can connect your students with. I know not all high schools have dual enrollment programs, but this is a great area of growth even for my school. So I want to kind of wrap up. I have about maybe 5 minutes left. I could talk for a long time about all of this, but I want to just end with some more concrete tips in terms of how you counsel different types of students. So say you have a student with a GPA above a 3.8. This is where it gets a little tricky, because you might think, wow, 3.8, that is a great GPA. As you know, if you're a fellow counselor, colleges are getting more and more competitive every year. And so I even like to disaggregate this into, okay, if a student has between a 3.7 and a 4.0, they're kind of in between. They're not, they're in a pool with a 4.0 or plus GPA student. They could maybe get overlooked because of that GPA difference. And so for an undocumented student, that struggle is heightened, right? If that's what all students are struggling with in the college admissions process, it is compounded when you are undocumented. And so for an undocumented student who is very, very high achieving, but maybe hasn't exceeded the 4.0, the essay and demonstrated interest is so important. So important. Are they telling their authentic story? Are they, crafting their application to truly showcase who they are? Are they establishing a relationship with that college? If it's an undocu-friendly college, they're going to try to help them out. If they truly want a student, I've seen some colleges do some great things for undocumented students. And so I would really say work with those students to demonstrate their interest to those institutions and to start building relationships with people in the admissions office. If a student has a 4.0 plus, actually the hurdle here is not always from the student admissions side, but in my experience working with undocumented families, the biggest hurdle for this type of student here is family literacy. Making sure that the family is informed and knows that opportunities are there for their children, but that sometimes, the child maybe might need to go a little bit further away for college. Maybe there's a school that meets full need. Maybe this is an EFC 0 family, meaning that they're low income. They would get their need met, and maybe a college has taken interest in the student, but that college is 2 states away. And so culturally, for a lot of undocumented families, whether they're Latinx or from other countries, that's hard. Crafting those college-going identities, making sure that their students are getting every opportunity. Of course, parents want that for their students, but sometimes they need someone else to tell them, listen, this is a really good deal. Like, you should take this. What questions do you have? How can I help you as a counselor feel comfortable with this big decision? And so getting to know the family context is so critical. I recently had a student who had an excellent 4.5 GPA. She was so high achieving, and she almost wasn't going to go to college at all because she was a financial caretaker in her family. Her family depended on her to pay the bills. And so that was the hurdle she was facing, not the admissions hurdle. And so it took a lot of conversations, a lot of listening to understand that what the family needed was more than just a quick, this is a really good opportunity, she should do it, but more of, what questions do you have? Can I get you connected to the school's financial aid office? What materials do you need so that you can start to see that this is a really good opportunity, but also respecting their values and respecting their voice as family, as the student's family. There are some great lists online for undocu-friendly colleges. So colleges that often give a lot of financial aid to these higher achieving students. If you Google undocu-friendly colleges, you will get a list. And I'm not going to name drop here, but definitely colleagues or even asking me offline, I could tell you, local colleges that I've heard of in my experience have been very generous to undocumented students. Not all colleges are, which is the sad truth. If a student is between a 3 and 3.8 GPA, things are a little different. So for this strategy, I think you can use, and you probably already use with a lot of your non-undocumented students, but really the strategic undermatching here is critical. Colleges that give merit aid because of GPA. So if you have a 3.6 student, right, I would obviously encourage them to have reach schools. That is important. But if they're undocumented, I would really also encourage them to undermatch a little bit and try to get as much merit aid as possible. Can the student live at home? That is a question I ask all of my students and families. Saving money on room and board can be the difference maker, especially if you're around the Boston area. If they can live at home, commute, and save on that room and board and get merit aid for just their tuition, they'll most often than not still have a gap. So that bill will still be substantial, maybe 2 or 3K, 4K, 5K, but it is much more doable than obviously something far greater for a lot of families. So that open communication too, from the financial standpoint, is so critical. If you're starting to meet your families in junior year, if you're a college counselor, sort of having open conversations about this and starting to lay the groundwork for them. Again, family literacy is really key for a family with immigration status concerns. And then again, think creatively, right? Do students have relatives? A state level DREAM Act. If a student has relatives there, can live there, and then eventually get in-state tuition, that would be a great sort of path for them to follow. Again, it's not that linear path, it's that creative path. But that's why you are such an important piece of that. You can expose your students to think creatively. And then finally, how do you counsel a student with a GPA below 3 or students that are hesitant to go to college? I think for me, in my years of experience counseling undocumented students who may be hesitant to go to college, I think the most important piece is to infuse your conversations with career vocabulary. It's okay, obviously, to narrate the college-going mentality. That is great, but what are their interests? What are their particular skills? Do you have an interest in a trade? Could you maybe get a certificate in something and then open up your own business? I think making sure that students feel heard when it comes to their interests can help you match them with more accessible post-secondary paths. I talked a little bit about, you know, being an independent contractor. So I've had students in the past, for example, say they want to open up their own hair salon or go into interpreting or be, I don't know, an electrician, a mechanic. I know these are all trades for the most part, but they're a great entry point into a long-lasting career. And so if your student has a work permit, things are very much easier because they can get more apprenticeships. But if there's no work permit, I would encourage a student to get linked with, for example, in Massachusetts, we have a great advocacy organization called the Student Immigrant Movement, filled with wonderful advocates and college students who are undocumented, who can provide, you know, mentorship and support if the student wants to strike out on their own. They can be independent contractors, for example, and work for themselves while you know, pursuing the career that they wanted. It just might look different. And I think if you know that as a counselor, then you can say that and name that for a student and normalize with a student, and through conversations, get them to sort of realize that, understand that, be okay with that, and actually be excited by that. I think that's really where the rubber hits the road and where we can be the most useful and effective with our students. So for the sake of time, I hit everything I wanted to hit. There are a few more slides here with resources and links and other things, but I'm going to pause right here and see if there are any questions I can answer before we wrap things up.
Andrea, thank you so much. And I think I should also share with this group that you will be presenting on this topic again for us, but for families and students directly on, is it October 7th?
I believe so, yes.
I think so. So you can also send your families to mefa.org/events, and Andrea will be with us again because obviously there's so much wonderful information here. Andrea, I have two questions that I think I'll touch on because you really answered a lot of the other ones that people had. But one counselor asked that I'm going to read the question. When I have called a public community college, they said that if a student graduated from a Mass high school, they would be considered a Mass state resident for tuition purposes, regardless of documentation. Is that true? Great.
So
yeah.
If someone is telling you that in the office, go with it. Don't question it, and get your student in-state tuition. And I guess all I have to say really is that it differs. You know, there haven't been these like wide sweeping state level, you know, laws in place that really mandate these things. So different schools interpret the information they get from the state in different ways. So some schools will give you that messaging, in which case, hooray, and like, yes, go for it. And you might call a different college and they might say, hey, no. That's what's frustrating, and that's what's really hard. And I'm so glad that you're the one also calling and can maybe interpret the answer to the students, because imagine being a student who's undocumented, who's already gathering up the courage to call a college, and they get met with no, or I don't know, let me check, and then they get hung up on. So that's really great that you're calling, and I would say keep calling, and it's okay to be frustrated. I am frustrated all the time when I'm working with undocumented students, but don't lose hope, because there are institutions that are actively working to make things better.
And it's funny, I just received a question, is the October 7th webinar in Spanish or English? And so I will answer the question that it's in English, but I'm going to say thank you. That's a very good suggestion. So stay tuned. I won't make any other promises. But I will mention also that we are going to have a college financing webinar in Spanish. I'm afraid to say the date off the top of my head, but again, go to that mefa.org/events and you'll be able to see that we have one of those. Going to quickly ask two more questions, I think, just given the time. there's a question, well, two questions that are a little bit, one is, do you have any resources for mental health and not catastrophic mental health, which sometimes is covered more easily than just everyday emotional strain? So that's one. And the other is, have you found that sometimes lawyers may take advantage of students who are trying to get a certain status, and how would you advise students on that?
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. So the first question around mental health. There are so many wonderful resources online. I think United We Dream is sort of the national network for student organizers, and they put on a lot of great videos and resources. But I think more than that, that's a Google search. But more than that, I had a wonderful college student once tell me, and he was involved with SIN as well, so he was undocumented. And I'll never forget what he said. He said the undocumented movement, our fight to get comprehensive immigration reform, just as undocumented people that come together, our movement is around storytelling. It's anchored in storytelling. And I will never forget that, because I think students that are undocumented are often very alone or feel isolated because they think they're the only ones. And so one, connecting them to other students, to the state level student advocacy groups like SIN, is so amazing, because they start to see they're not alone and others share my struggles, and I'm going to talk. And then the storytelling piece of highlighting student stories, maybe not your own students initially, because that might feel too like they're being exposed, but maybe during Latinx Heritage Month, which is this month, highlight an undocumented Latinx story. There's so many beautiful ones on United We Dream and online, and that can start to open up and sort of liberate that campus feeling, that climate, and encourage students to tell their own stories, whether it's in writing to you or to keep a journal. It just goes a long way. And then the second question was around lawyers. I think if you go through a reputable source like the Mura Coalition, who's amazing, they do tremendous work here in Massachusetts, you will find very reputable sort of agencies or practices. But it's a personality thing, and it's a being overworked thing. So even at these wonderful, reputable legal agencies, you will find lawyers that just are not good at communicating, or just have too much on their plate. They leave something hanging. So I think as long as you're going through these agencies, sometimes they have wait lists, but it's worth getting on them. They're going to be okay. Where I worry is sort of the word of mouth. Oh, this lawyer helped my cousin, so now we have an allegiance to this lawyer, and we can only work with this lawyer, even though they're charging us so much money. I think that's where, just a quick note of, hey, do you know that you can switch lawyers? Or that, there are other agencies that may not charge you as much. Have you looked into them? Here's a pamphlet, or here's a printout. I think just a gentle nudge could go a long way, but I think there's something to be said about, like, there's that allegiance sometimes with community lawyers or people. I would warn you, though, warn your students and families about scams. There are a lot of scams in smaller immigrant communities around just everywhere, where they say, come, we will help you. We're a notario público. We can do this. We have a license to practice law. But I would be wary of that. So if it's too good to be true, it probably is.
And I'll ask one more, and then I think we covered them all, which makes me happy. You mentioned something about students starting their own business, and the person just asked, don't they need a social security number to do that? How can you do that if you're undocumented?
That's a great question. And so I think that there's a simple answer to this, is that a lot of undocumented individuals file taxes using an ITIN number. And so an ITIN, I-T-I-N, is a perfectly legal way to file your taxes. And so that's what a lot of independent contractors end up doing. And it's great. They're honest, they file taxes, they're doing their thing, and it's perfectly accepted by the IRS.
Andrea, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for these great questions and for all the work that you do. And we'll continue on. And good luck with everything. We'll talk again soon. And please stay in touch and let us know how we can be helpful. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to be here. Bye.
Bye.